The dust of Havenwood settled not on things, but in them. It was a fine, pale grit that worked its way into the grain of the warped floorboards of the old general store, into the cracked leather of the truck seats, into the very marrow of the silence that owned the town. Anya Sharma, late of the United States Army, breathed it in as if it were peace itself. For 62 years, the world had been a loud place, a cacophony of orders and explosions and the hollow echo of unspoken grief. Here, the only sound was the wind, a lonely surveyor whistling through the skeletal remains of a dozen buildings. She had bought the whole town, all 20 acres of forgotten history and the surrounding 1,000 acres of high desert scrubland, with the entirety of her back pay and disability settlement. An act of profound madness or ultimate sanity, she wasn't yet sure which. Beside her, Ghost sat, a statue of slate gray and bone-white fur. His ears, scarred at the tips from a life before this one, swiveled independently, parsing the whisper of the wind from the scuttling of a lizard 100 yards away. He was not a pet. He was a partner. They had served together in a different, greener hell, and the bond forged in the crucible of that place was more absolute than blood. He was a German shepherd of impeccable breeding and brutal training, now retired to the simple duty of watching over his lone charge. His presence was a physical weight against her leg, a low thrum of life that anchored her to the present. The sun, a merciless sovereign in the vast cerulean sky, beat down on the tin roof of the porch where they sat. Anya traced the jagged line of the distant mesas, their purple shadows deepening as the afternoon wore on. This was the routine. Watch the sun crawl, feel the heat bake the trauma from her bones, and wait for the cool blanket of night to bring the stars, those cold, indifferent witnesses. But today, the routine was broken. Ghost, normally a creature of profound stillness, shifted. A low rumble, less a growl than a seismic disturbance deep in his chest, vibrated through the floorboards. His head was low, his ruff a subtle, bristling ridge. His gaze was fixed not on the horizon, not on any visible threat, but on the ground itself, near the old, dry well at the center of what was once the town square. Anya's hand, gnarled with arthritis but steady as a gunner's sight, went to his neck, her fingers sinking into the thick fur. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice raspy from disuse. "What is it?" He didn't relax. His nostrils flared, deciphering a language she could not speak, a scent carried on the wind that was wrong, an impurity in their sanctuary. He whined, a thin, sharp sound of distress that cut through the placid afternoon. In all their years together, through firefights and IEDs, she had heard him make that sound only twice. Both times, it had preceded death. Anya's body, trained to respond to his cues with Pavlovian immediacy, tensed. The comfortable slouch of the retiree vanished, replaced by the rigid posture of a soldier on watch. Her eyes, which had been gazing placidly at the landscape, now scanned it, breaking it down into sectors, analyzing fields of fire, seeking cover and concealment. The town was no longer a refuge. It was a tactical position. The wind shifted, and for the first time, she caught a faint, acrid undertone beneath the familiar sense of sagebrush and dust. It was chemical, unnatural, a violation. Ghost rose, his movements fluid and silent, a predator assessing its territory. He took a few steps toward the well, his body low, then stopped, looking back at her. It was an invitation, a warning, an order. Something was buried here, not just the history of a dead town, but a secret that was still alive and toxic. The peace she had paid for with blood and treasure was a mirage, and the silence was not empty, but full of a threat she could not yet see. The dog had been the first to notice. He was always the first. His senses were a perimeter, more reliable than any wire or camera. He was telling her now what he had told her in the Kringle and the Hellman. The ground beneath their feet was compromised. Anya pushed herself up from the creaking chair, her joints protesting but her will unbending. She picked up the old hickory walking stick leaning against the wall, a stick that concealed 3 feet of tempered steel, and followed the silent, gray sentinel into the dying light of the afternoon. The war had followed her home, it seemed, or perhaps it had simply been waiting for her here, dormant in the poisoned earth of a place called Havenwood. She had come to this ghost town to bury her own ghosts, But it seemed the land had other plans. It had secrets to give up, and it had chosen her and her silent, watchful companion as its confessors. Ghost led her not directly to the old well, but in a wide, circling path, his nose hovering an inch above the cracked earth. He moved with the methodical precision of a minesweeper, his paws silent on the desiccated ground. Anya followed, her own senses now screamingly alert. The chemical tang she'd caught on the wind was stronger here, a bitter, metallic scent that coated the back of her throat. It was the smell of industry, of carelessness, of something deliberately hidden. She watched the dog, his body a taut line of inquiry. He paused near a patch of earth where the hardy desert scrub had withered into brittle, blackened skeletons. Even the ubiquitous creosote bushes, tenacious survivors that could thrive on rock and neglect, had surrendered here. The soil was a sickly, dark color, slick with an oily sheen despite the baking heat. Anya knelt, her knee cracking in protest, and touched the ground. It was cool, unnaturally so, and her fingers came away with a greasy, dark residue. She brought them to her nose, ignoring the instinct to recoil. It wasn't motor oil. It was something more complex, a cocktail of solvents she vaguely recognized from her time as a quartermaster, the kind of fluids used to clean heavy machinery, carcinogenic and persistent. Ghost whined again, a low note of confirmation, and nudged her hand with his wet nose, as if to say, see? A memory, sharp and unwelcome as shrapnel, tore through the calm facade she had so carefully constructed. Afghanistan. A village elder, his face a roadmap of dignified suffering, pointing to a well. He spoke in soft Pashto, the interpreter's voice flat and emotionless in her ear. The water makes our children sick. It tastes of strange metal. It began after the contractors built their outpost on the hill. She had filed the report. It had vanished into the bureaucratic maw, another piece of inconvenient data in a war of inconvenient truths. The children had kept drinking the water. The memory coiled in her gut, a cold serpent of shame. She had followed orders. She had moved on to the next objective. She hadn't fought. Not for them. Now, that same cold serpent was stirring in her own backyard. This wasn't a forgotten well in a foreign land. This was her land. Hers and Ghost's. She had signed the deed. She had drawn the line. Standing up, she scanned the perimeter of the dead zone. It formed a rough, unnatural line, leading from the direction of the low-lying hills to the east and ending near the well. A buried pipeline? A drainage ditch, long since filled in? Her mind, trained for pattern recognition, began to work, stripping away the years of civilian quiet and re-engaging the old, cold logic of threat analysis. She followed the line of dead vegetation, Ghost pacing her, a silent shadow at her side. The trail led her away from the cluster of buildings, toward the edge of her property, where a dilapidated barbed wire fence marked the boundary. Beyond it, the land was owned by an anonymous corporate entity, a holding company called TerraVex Properties, according to the county assessor's map she had studied before buying. They owned thousands of acres, a vast, empty buffer that stretched toward the mountains. The trail of poisoned earth stopped just short of her fence line, but as she looked closer, she saw it. A newly capped iron pipe, barely 2 inches in diameter, protruding from the ground. It had been crudely camouflaged with rocks and dead brush, a hasty, sloppy job. An outflow pipe, designed to leach its contents into the porous soil, to let the desert swallow the evidence. Anger, an emotion she had kept leashed for a decade, began to smolder. It was a clean, hot anger, familiar and almost welcome after years of numb resignation. This was not the ambiguous morality of counterinsurgency. This was simpler. This was filth. Someone was using her sanctuary as a sewer. She looked back at Havenwood, the ramshackle buildings silhouetted against the sinking sun. She had seen it as a monument to endings, a place where things came to rest. But it wasn't dead. It was being murdered, slowly, from below. Ghost sat beside the pipe, his duty done for the moment. He looked up at her, his intelligent, amber eyes seeming to ask the question that now burned in her mind. What are you going to do, Commander? The title, unspoken, echoed in her head. It was who she had been. A person who made decisions, who took responsibility, who protected her people and her position. She had walked away from that life, believing she had nothing left to protect. She had been wrong. She reached down and scratched the dog behind his scarred ears. "All right, boy," she said, her voice a low growl that mirrored the one he had made earlier. "Let's run a little recon." The peace was over. The mission had begun. Anya spent the next 3 days conducting a meticulous survey of her own land, falling back on the ingrained disciplines of a lifetime in uniform. She moved with a purpose that had been absent for years, the lethargy of her quiet retirement burning away like morning fog. With Ghost as her ever-vigilant point man, she walked the entire 1,000-acre perimeter, her old compass in hand, her eyes missing nothing. She wasn't just looking, she was observing, interpreting the landscape as if it were a battlefield. She noted the flow of the seasonal washes, the direction of the prevailing winds, the subtle dips and rises in the terrain that could conceal a trail or a pipeline. She found 2 more areas of blighted vegetation, smaller than the first but just as dead, both radiating from her property line with TerraVex. The poison was seeping, a slow, methodical invasion. On the second day, she took soil and water samples. Using sterilized glass jars from the general store's dusty shelves, she collected earth from the contaminated zones and, for control, from healthy ground a half-mile away. She drew water from her own deep well, which thankfully seemed unaffected for now, and then, using a long rope and a weighted jar, she managed to collect a murky sample from the bottom of the Old Town well, the epicenter of Ghost's initial alarm. The water that came up was thick with a dark, viscous sediment and smelled faintly of rust and chemicals. Each sample was carefully labeled with a grease pencil, the date, time, and coordinates noted in a small, waterproof notebook. It was the methodical, tedious work of evidence collection, a process she knew well. Doubt was a luxury, data was ammunition. By the 4th morning, she knew she needed more information, the kind she couldn't get from walking her own land. She needed history, context, human intelligence. She left Ghost on watch, his posture on the porch a clear signal that he understood the gravity of her departure, and drove her dust-caked pickup truck the 40 miles to Barrows Creek, the nearest inhabited place. Barrows Creek was a town clinging to life by a thread of nostalgia and the stubbornness of its few hundred residents. Its main street had more boarded-up windows than open businesses, but one of those businesses was Jedediah's Hardware and Feed. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful, anachronistic welcome. The air inside smelled of oiled wood, fertilizer, and old coffee. Behind the counter stood Jedediah Jed Miller himself, a man who looked as if he'd been carved from the same ancient lumber as his store shelves. He was wiry, with a face like a dried apple and eyes the pale, washed-out blue of the desert sky. He'd sold Anya her generator and a truckload of supplies when she first moved in, asking few questions but watching her with a shrewd, not unkind curiosity. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Jed said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "The hermit of Havenwood. Run out of canned beans already?" "Not yet, Jed," Anya replied, her tone even. She leaned against the counter, letting her eyes adjust to the dim interior. "I need some information." Jed wiped the counter with a rag that had seen better decades. "Information's free. It's the good information that costs you," he winked. "What's on your mind? Ghosts in the Old Town keeping you up at night?" "Something like that," Anya said, deciding on a direct approach. She trusted the man's face, the steadiness of his gaze. "Tell me about TerraVex Properties." The humor evaporated from Jed's expression. He stopped wiping the counter and looked at her, his pale eyes narrowing. "That's a name I ain't heard spoken with much curiosity in a long time. Mostly folks around here try to forget it." "Why you asking?" "They're my neighbors." "Neighbor's a friendly word," Jed grunted. "They ain't friendly. They're a holding company for a bigger outfit, some resource conglomerate out of Houston. Bought up all that land back in the 90s. Said they were going to do some exploratory drilling, maybe a new copper mine. Brought in a lot of equipment, hired some locals for a while. Made a lot of promises." He gestured vaguely toward the street. "Then, one day they just packed up. Said the yields weren't worth the cost of extraction. Laid everyone off, put up fences, and vanished. Left a lot of folks high and dry. Left the land to rot. They're still paying the property taxes," Anya stated. It was a fact she'd checked. Keeps the county from seizing it. "Cheaper to pay the taxes than to clean up whatever mess they made out there," Jed said, his voice low and bitter. "We always figured they were doing something else. The geology in those hills ain't right for copper." But nobody could ever prove anything. They got lawyers thicker than flies on a carcass. Anya absorbed this, fitting the pieces together. A big company, a failed project, a hasty departure. It was a classic story. Anyone ever complain about strange things happening out there? Jed leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Old man Hemlock, who owned your place before the bank took it, he used to complain. Said his well water started tasting funny. Said his cattle started getting sick. He tried to raise a fuss with the EPA, the county. They sent out a kid in a polo shirt who took a few samples, said everything was within acceptable limits. A month later, Hemlock's prize bull was dead. A year after that, the bank foreclosed. He died a broken man. The story settled heavily in the quiet store. It wasn't a ghost story, it was worse. It was a story of methodical, bureaucratic cruelty. What kind of mess? Anya asked quietly. Jed shook his head, looking down at his worn hands on the counter. No one knows for sure, but the trucks they were running in and out of there at night, they weren't haulers. They were tankers, the kind you use to haul liquid, and they were always coming in full and leaving empty. He looked up, his eyes locking with hers. You found something, didn't you? Out on your land. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of grim certainty. Anya didn't answer directly. She pulled one of the sealed glass jars from her canvas bag and placed it on the counter between them. Inside, the dark, oily soil sat inert, a silent accusation. Jed stared at it for a long moment. The cheerful bell above the door seemed a world away. Lord have mercy, he breathed. It's still there. The sight of the jar on Jed's counter had changed something between them. The polite distance of a shopkeeper and a customer dissolved, replaced by the grim alliance of shared knowledge. Jed pushed his glasses up his nose and stared at the dark soil, his face a mask of weary resignation. I knew it, he said, more to himself than to Anya. We all knew they were dirty, but seeing it, that's different. He looked up at her, his gaze sharp and assessing. What's your plan, soldier? The word soldier didn't sound casual. It was a recognition. He saw the ramrod posture, the economy of movement, the way her eyes never stopped scanning. Anya appreciated the perception. It saved time. First, I get this analyzed, she said, tapping the jar. I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with. Is there a lab nearby that won't be in TerraVex's pocket? Jed stroked his chin, thinking. There's a university extension 2 counties over, in Rock Springs. They do agricultural testing. Might be your best bet. But it'll cost you. I'll manage, Anya said. The next step was more delicate. Then I need to know who I'm fighting. You're fighting a ghost, Jed sighed. TerraVex is just a name on paper. The real monster has 1,000 faces, all of them lawyers and accountants. Before Anya could press him further, the bell on the door chimed again. A man stepped inside, and the atmosphere in the store instantly chilled. He was not a local. He wore expensive, dust-free boots, creased khaki trousers, and a crisp, dark blue polo shirt with a small, stylized TerraVex logo embroidered on the chest. He was in his late 30s, with a gym-fit body and the kind of blandly handsome face that was easy to forget and hard to trust. His eyes, however, were cold and reptilian. They swept the store, lingered on Anya for a fraction of a second too long, and then settled on Jed. Morning, Jedediah, he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. Just checking in. Making sure our assets in the area are secure. Morning, Sterling, Jed replied, his voice carefully neutral, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the counter. Everything's quiet as a tomb out there. Just the way your company likes it. Sterling's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. We prefer to think of it as preserved. We have a vested interest in maintaining the natural character of the region. He turned his attention to Anya. I don't believe we've met. I'm Mark Sterling, regional manager for TerraVex. He offered a hand. Anya ignored it. Anya Sharma, she said, her voice flat. I own Havenwood. A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed Sterling's face before it was smoothed over. Ah, yes, the recluse. We heard someone had bought the old Hemlock place. An interesting choice for a retirement property. Very rustic. The word rustic was an insult, a dismissal of her home as a worthless ruin. It's quiet, Anya said, her gaze unwavering. I like quiet, of course, Sterling said, his smile tightening. We all value our privacy. That's why I was so surprised to see fresh tire tracks on the access road bordering your property this morning. Our security patrols are very diligent. It was a threat, wrapped in the language of corporate concern. He was telling her she was being watched. He knew she'd been exploring. Anya felt a familiar coldness settle in her chest. The first probe, the initial testing of defenses. The wind blows the dust around, she said, her voice betraying no emotion. Makes old tracks look new. Sterling's eyes flicked down to the glass jar on the counter, which Jed had discreetly tried to cover with his rag. For a heartbeat, the mask of civility slipped, and Anya saw the predator beneath. His gaze was sharp, hostile. He looked back up at her, his smile gone completely. You should be careful out there, Miss Sharma. It's rough country. Old wells, unstable ground. People can get hurt if they wander where they don't belong. He let the words hang in the air, a palpable menace. Then, the smile was back, synthetic and cold. Well, Jedediah, always a pleasure. I'll be in touch. He turned and walked out, the bell chiming his departure. The silence he left behind was heavy and suffocating. Jed let out a long, slow breath. That's him, he said, his voice barely a whisper. That's the devil himself. He was the one who came to town with all the promises back in the day. And he was the one who delivered the bad news when they shut it all down. Anya watched through the window as Sterling got into a clean, black SUV parked across the street. Another man was in the driver's seat. Security. He knows, Anya said. Or he suspects. He saw the jar. Jed confirmed, his face grim. They've been sitting on this secret for 20 years. They're not going to let some newcomer dig it up. He looked at Anya, his expression a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration. He just threatened you, ma'am. Right here in my store. It wasn't the first time I've been threatened by a man in a polo shirt, Anya said, her voice laced with a dry, metallic humor. She picked up the jar of soil. Her course of action was now crystal clear. The enemy had a face. The fight was on. Jed, she said, her voice dropping into a command tone she hadn't used in a decade. You said people in this town have long memories. Who else remembers the promises TerraVex made? Who else lost something when they left? The old man straightened up, a flicker of forgotten fire in his pale eyes. He was seeing the commander now, not the hermit. Most folks are too scared to talk, he said. But I can think of one or two who are too stubborn or too angry to stay quiet. Anya nodded, a curt, decisive gesture. Good, because I'm going to need a fire team. The encounter with Sterling lit a fuse in Anya. The years of cultivated numbness, the deliberate practice of disengagement, were burned away by the cold, clean fire of purpose. Driving back to Havenwood, she wasn't retreating to her sanctuary. She was returning to her firebase. The world had shrunk to the size of a mission parameter. Secure the objective, neutralize the threat. When her truck rumbled to a stop in front of the general store, Ghost was waiting on the porch, not sitting but standing, a gray wraith in the twilight, his head high and alert. He knew. He had smelled the change on her, the scent of adrenaline and conflict that had once been their daily perfume. He trotted down the steps to meet her, pressing his head firmly against her leg. It was a gesture of solidarity. I am with you. That night, Anya didn't sit and watch the stars. She worked. By the light of a single lantern, she cleared the long counter in the store, unrolling the topographical maps of her property and the surrounding area. She began to mark them up, noting the contaminated sites, the location of the hidden pipe, the access roads Sterling's men were using. Her movements were economical and precise. She was building a threat assessment, creating a picture of the battlefield. The quiet of the ghost town was no longer peaceful. It was tactical. Every gust of wind could be a vehicle approaching, every shadow a man hiding. Sometime after midnight, she paused, rubbing her tired eyes, and her gaze fell upon a small, footlocker-sized crate in the corner. It was the one piece of her past she hadn't unpacked, a sealed archive of the woman she used to be. With a sense of grim ceremony, she pried it open. Inside, nestled in foam, was her old gear. A satellite phone, a pair of high-powered binoculars with a built-in rangefinder, a sophisticated water testing kit, far more advanced than her simple jars. And at the bottom, wrapped in an oilcloth, her service pistol, a Sig Sauer P226. She field-stripped it on the counter, the familiar clicks and slides of the metal parts a comforting catechism. She cleaned and oiled it with practiced efficiency, her hands moving with a memory that transcended thought. Holding the reassembled weapon, its weight solid and real in her palm, was like shaking hands with a ghost of herself. A more dangerous, more certain version of herself. She didn't want to be that person again, but Sterling and TerraVex had left her no choice. They had trespassed not just on her land, but on her peace, the one thing she was no longer willing to surrender. The next day brought the first countermove. As she was making her coffee at dawn, she heard the low drone of an engine. From the cover of a second-story window, she watched through her binoculars as Sterling's black SUV drove slowly along the fence line. It stopped, and two men got out. They weren't wearing corporate polos. They were dressed in work clothes, carrying tools. They methodically began cutting the barbed wire fence in a dozen places, rolling it back to create wide gaps. It was a subtle act of aggression, a violation of her boundary. They were demonstrating their power, showing her that her locks and fences meant nothing. They were also sending a message: we can get to you anytime we want. Later that day, the second blow fell. She went to her well to draw water and found the pump handle seized, the mechanism sabotaged. A simple piece of metal had been jammed into the gears, a deliberate, malicious act. It wasn't permanent damage. She could fix it in an hour, but the intent was clear. They were escalating, moving from veiled threats to direct harassment. They were trying to make her life untenable, to drive her out with 1,000 small cuts. That evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, mirroring the turmoil inside her, Anya sat on the porch, the pistol holstered on her hip, ghost a silent statue at her feet. She thought of the men and women she had led. She thought of Sergeant Evans, a kid from Ohio who could quote Shakespeare and disarm an IED with the same steady hands, lost to a sniper's bullet she never saw coming. She thought of Corporal Martinez, a young mother who bled out in a medevac helicopter, her last words a question about her daughter. The weight of their faces, their sacrifices, settled on her. She had survived, and her survival felt like a debt she could never repay. She had come to Havenwood to forget, to let the silence scour those memories clean. But now she understood. This fight, this poisoned land, was not a new war. It was a continuation of the old one. Sterling and his corporation, with their casual cruelty and their disregard for the lives they ruined, were just another face of the same enemy she had fought her entire life. The powerful who preyed on the vulnerable, the greedy who sacrificed others for profit. Protecting this small piece of earth, exposing their crimes, became an act of redemption. It was a way to honor the memory of Evans and Martinez. It was a chance, perhaps her last one, to win a battle that truly mattered, to defend a place not because she was ordered to, but because it was right. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, spattering in the dust. Ghost looked up at her, his amber eyes reflecting the flashes of lightning in the distance. He saw the change in her, the hardening of her jaw, the focus in her eyes. The wounded veteran was gone. In her place sat the commander, and she would not be moved. The sabotage of her well and fence was a declaration of war, and Anya Sharma accepted the terms. Her first move was strategic, not tactical. She drove back to Rock Springs, to the University Extension Lab, a cooler containing the carefully cataloged soil and water samples on the seat beside her. She paid in cash for a full-spectrum analysis, requesting expedited results, and leaving Jed's name as a contact, not her own. She was now operating under the assumption that her name was flagged. From now on, she would be a ghost, just like her companion. Her second move was to follow up on the names Jed had given her. The first was Martha Riley, a woman in her late 70s who ran a small goat farm on the outskirts of Barrows Creek. Her land bordered the vast TerraVex holdings to the north. When Anya pulled up, Martha was mending a fence, her movements slow but deliberate, her face a testament to a life lived under the unforgiving sun. Anya introduced herself simply, explaining she was Martha's new, distant neighbor. Martha's eyes, bright and intelligent in her wrinkled face, sized Anya up. "Heard about you," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Jed says you're not the type to scare easy. Jed talks too much," Anya replied, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "He also said your goats have been sick." Martha's face darkened. She straightened up, wiping her hands on her canvas apron. "Not just sick. Barren. I've lost 3 kids this season before they were weaned." The vet stumped. "Says it's some kind of environmental toxin, but he can't prove it. My well water tastes fine, but the creek they drink from, It's been looking oily after a hard rain. She pointed a calloused finger toward the east, toward the hills controlled by TerraVex. That creek, it starts up there. On their land. Anya listened, her expression somber. It was another piece of the puzzle, a corroborating account from a different vector. They cut my fences yesterday, Anya said quietly. Martha snorted, a sound of contemptuous disbelief. That's their way. Little reminders of who's in charge. They did the same to me a few years back when I joined a lawsuit against them with some other ranchers. The suit got buried in paperwork and legal fees, and strange things started happening. Flat tires. A barn fire the sheriff called inconclusive. My prize-winning billy goat disappeared. The others dropped the suit. I didn't. The woman was a fighter, a fellow soldier in a different kind of war. Anya felt a kinship with her, a recognition of the same stubborn refusal to be broken. TerraVex is dumping poison on their land, Anya stated, not as a theory, but as a fact. It's leaching into the groundwater, into your creek. It's on my property. I have samples. Martha stared at her, her bright eyes wide. For a long moment, she said nothing, the only sound the bleating of a distant goat. Then she nodded slowly. I knew it. In my bones, I knew it. What are you going to do? I'm going to prove it, Anya said. And I'm going to make them pay for it. But I can't do it alone. The whole valley is scared of them, dearie, Martha said, her voice softening with a sad wisdom. They've got the money, the lawyers. They've got the county commissioner in their pocket. Fighting them is like punching water. Then we need a bigger fist, Anya countered. We need evidence so undeniable that the EPA and the national news can't ignore it. We need to go public. The second name on Jed's list was Ben Carter, the former foreman for the TerraVex exploratory project, now a bitter, unemployed mechanic running a failing garage on the edge of town. Anya found him under a rusted-out Ford, his face and arms smeared with grease. He was a big man, gone to seed, with the defeated slump of someone who'd lost a fight with life. He was reluctant to talk at first, his responses clipped and suspicious. But when Anya mentioned Sterling's name, a flicker of hatred ignited in his eyes. Sterling, he spat, sitting up and wiping his hands on a rag. That snake oil salesman. He's the one who looked me in the eye and promised us all 20 years of steady work. Said we were building a future for this town. Anya let him talk, sensing the dam of years of resentment was about to break. We weren't drilling for no copper, Ben said, his voice dropping. The core samples were all wrong. I'm no geologist, but I know junk rock when I see it. The whole thing was a sham. A cover for what? Anya asked, her voice low and steady. Ben looked around nervously, as if the ghosts of TerraVex were listening from the shadows of his own garage. Waste disposal, he whispered. They were trucking in toxic waste from chemical plants and refineries back east. Stuff nobody else would touch. My crew, we were hired to drill deep injection wells. We pumped millions of gallons of God knows what into the ground, a mile deep. Sterling told us it was non-hazardous industrial brine, said it was perfectly safe. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that held no humor. 3 of the men on my crew are dead now. Cancers you don't see in men their age. I've had a cough for 10 years that no doctor can explain. We were disposable, here it was. The confession, the inside source, the heart of the crime. They kept records, logs? Anya asked, her mind racing. Of course, Ben said. Every tanker had a manifest. Every well had a pressure and volume log. Sterling was meticulous about the paperwork. It was all stored in the site office, a reinforced building up in the hills. He looked at her, a glimmer of desperate hope warring with years of fear in his eyes. But it's a fortress up there now. Fences, cameras, security patrols. You can't get within a mile of it. Every fortress has a weakness, Anya said, the words coming easily, a creed she had lived by. She looked at the 2 people she had recruited, a stubborn old goat farmer and a broken-down mechanic. It wasn't much of a fire team, but their anger was real. Their knowledge was vital. And combined with her skills, it might just be enough. The storm that had threatened the night before had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp. For the first time in a long time, Anya felt a sense of clarity, of hope. She wasn't just fighting for her own peace anymore. She was fighting for Martha's goats, for Ben's dead friends, for Old Man Hemlock and his prize bull. She was fighting for the soul of a valley that had been quietly poisoned, one secret at a time. The lab results came back 3 days later, delivered via a cryptic phone call from Jed. He didn't read them over the line. "Package for you at the store," was all he said, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. Anya drove to town, the back of her truck loaded with empty water barrels. It was her cover story, a plausible reason for the trip. In the back room of the hardware store, away from any prying eyes, Jed handed her a thick manila envelope. "It's worse than we thought," he said, his face pale. Anya opened the envelope and spread the pages of the report on a dusty workbench. Her eyes scanned the columns of chemical names and concentration levels. It was a toxicologist's nightmare. Benzene, arsenic, lead, mercury, and a host of complex chlorinated solvents and polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. The levels weren't just above the legal limits. They were hundreds, in some cases thousands, of times higher. The soil on her land wasn't just contaminated, it was hazardous waste. The report included a stark warning from the lab. Direct contact should be avoided. Inhalation of dust from affected soil could cause severe long-term health effects. The identified contaminants are highly carcinogenic and are known to cause birth defects and neurological damage. Martha's barren goats. Ben's crew, dead of rare cancers. It all snapped into a sickeningly clear focus. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance. It was mass poisoning on a generational scale. "This is the weapon," Anya said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. She tapped the report with her finger. "This is the proof that can't be ignored, proof from your land," Jed pointed out. "Sterling will just say it was the old man, Hemlock. Or you. They'll bury you in legal challenges, claim you're trying to extort them." "He's right," came a voice from the doorway. Ben Carter stood there, his large frame filling the entrance. He had a sheaf of hand-drawn maps in his hand. "This proves what's happening. But to prove who did it, you need the manifests. You need the logs from their site office." He spread his crude maps next to the lab report. They were drawn from memory, detailing the layout of the TerraVex facility in the hills. He pointed a grease-stained finger at a small, square building. "That's the operations center. Reinforced concrete, steel door. Sterling called it the data archive. That's where the records are." Anya studied the maps, her mind already shifting into operational planning mode. "Perimeter, 10-foot chain-link fence, topped with razor wire," Ben said. "Motion sensor lights. Infrared cameras on the 4 corners of the main building. 2-man patrols in an SUV, running the fence line every 2 hours. Irregular intervals, power source. They've got their own generator, but it's for backup. They're tied into the main grid. Power line comes in from the north, follows the main access road, a fortress, like you said," Anya murmured. It was a hard target. A frontal assault was impossible. It required subtlety, precision. A classic infiltration. "There's a weak spot," Ben said, leaning closer and tapping a spot on the map. "On the eastern side, there's a deep ravine. The fence has to follow the contour of the land there. The cameras have a blind spot in the deepest part of the gully. And the patrols, they don't like to get out of their truck. They just shine their spotlight down into it. If you're tucked in deep against the rock wall, they'll never see you. And how do you know all this?" Anya asked, her eyes narrowed. "Because I helped build it," Ben said, a bitter twist to his lips. "And because after they laid us all off, I spent a few nights up there with a bottle of whiskey and a pair of binoculars, thinking about all the ways I could burn it to the ground. Never had the guts, but I learned the layout. I learned their patterns. This was the intelligence she needed. Human intelligence from the inside, the most valuable kind." The plan began to form in her mind, a sequence of timed actions, contingencies, and calculated risks. It was a language she was fluent in. Phase 1, surveillance. Phase 2, infiltration. Phase 3, exfiltration with the objective. "We need to get in, get the files, and get out, without them ever knowing we were there," Anya said, thinking aloud. "If they know they've been compromised, they'll shred everything and we'll lose our chance." "How?" Jed asked, his voice laced with awe and fear. "Ben says it's a fortress. We'll need a diversion," Anya said, her eyes distant, already walking through the operation in her head. "Something to draw the patrol to the opposite side of the compound at a specific time. And we'll need to cut the power to the cameras and lights without tripping the backup generator." She looked at Martha, who had arrived silently and was listening from the doorway. "Martha, what's the weather forecast?" The old woman's eyes, surprisingly, lit up. Big storm front moving in tomorrow night. Thunder, lightning, high winds. The kind that always knocks the power out in the high country. Anya allowed herself a grim smile. Pathetic fallacy was on their side. The storm would be their cover. Jed, I need you to get me a pair of bolt cutters, 100 feet of climbing rope, and a portable battery pack. Ben, I need you to walk me through every inch of that map. I want to know where every rock and every shadow is. Martha, I need you to be our diversion. The old goat farmer raised a skeptical eyebrow. What am I going to do? Wave my knitting at them. You're going to call the county sheriff tomorrow night, right when the storm hits, Anya instructed. You're going to report trespassers on your land, near the TerraVex fence line. Say you saw flashlights. You'll sound like a panicked old woman. The sheriff's deputy is lazy. He won't go up there himself in a storm. He'll call TerraVex security and tell them to check it out. It'll pull their patrol to the north side of the compound, away from the ravine, for at least 20 minutes. The three of them stared at her. In the dusty back room of a small-town hardware store, a military operation was being born. Anya was no longer just a landowner defending her property. She was a field commander, planning a raid deep into enemy territory. And this time, her soldiers were a hardware store owner, a goat farmer, and a broken mechanic. The storm arrived as promised, a bruised purple mass that consumed the horizon and swallowed the setting sun. Wind whipped through Havenwood, rattling the tin roofs and moaning through the empty doorways like a chorus of the dead. Anya stood on the porch, feeling the electricity in the air, the raw power of the coming tempest. It was perfect. Ghost stood beside her, not anxious, but vibrating with a focused energy that mirrored her own. He understood the hunt was on. Dressed in dark, durable clothing, her face streaked with dirt for camouflage, Anya loaded her small pack. Bolt cutters, rope, the battery pack, a high-powered flashlight, her water testing kit now repurposed to hold tools, and the Sig Sauer, snug in its holster. Ben's hand-drawn map, protected in a plastic sleeve, was in her cargo pocket. She drove not her own truck, but Jed's old, battered farm vehicle, its engine noise and appearance unremarkable in this part of the country. She parked it in a thicket of juniper 2 miles from the TerraVex facility and went the rest of the way on foot, Ghost moving ahead of her, a silent gray scout in the deepening gloom. The rain began as they approached the perimeter fence, a cold, stinging downpour that quickly turned the ground to slick mud. It masked their sound and would wash away their tracks. The wind howled, covering any noise she might make. Anya found the ravine exactly where Ben had described it. It was a deep, jagged scar in the earth, filled with shadows and the growing roar of flash flood waters. She moved down into it, pressing herself against the rock wall as Ben had instructed. From here, she had a clear view of the fence line above and the squat, windowless operations building 100 yards beyond it. The compound was illuminated by harsh, sterile floodlights. The cameras perched on the building were black, unblinking eyes. She checked her watch. 2,100 hours. She settled in to wait, the cold rain plastering her hair to her face. Ghost lay at her feet, a motionless lump of fur that was somehow more alert than any human could be. He would be her early warning system. At 21:55, her sat phone, set to vibrate, buzzed in her pocket. A single text from Jed, go. It meant Martha had made the call. The diversion was in motion. 5 minutes later, the headlights of the security SUV appeared on the far side of the compound, heading north toward Martha's property. This was her window. It would be tight. Watch, she murmured to Ghost, and the dog's ears swiveled forward, his entire being focused on the task. Anya scrambled up the muddy bank of the ravine. Reaching the fence, she pulled out the heavy bolt cutters. The wind and rain were a deafening cloak of sound. 2 quick, powerful snaps and a section of the chain link was open. She slipped through, a shadow among shadows. Now for the power. Ben had told her the main junction box was on the pole just inside the fence line. It was an old, standard utility box. Inside, a single, heavy-duty breaker switch controlled the power to the entire site's lighting and security system. Killing it would trigger an alert and fire up the backup generator. But Ben had also told her about a flaw in their setup. A 5-second delay between the main power cutting out and the generator kicking in. 5 seconds was all she needed. She pried open the box. Her hands, though cold, were steady. She took a deep breath, flipped the main breaker, and immediately jammed a small, custom-made wooden wedge into the generator transfer switch, preventing it from engaging. The world went black. The floodlights died. The low hum of the electrical systems vanished. The only light was the intermittent, brilliant flash of lightning. She was running on the storm's clock now. She moved quickly, counting her steps, navigating from memory of the map. The operations building loomed before her, a dark concrete block. The door was, as Ben had said, steel. The lock was a digital keypad, now dead without power, but there was a manual key override. A standard high-security tumbler lock. Amateurs. From her kit, she pulled a set of tension wrenches and lock picks. This was an old skill, learned in a different life for a different purpose. Her fingers, numb with cold, felt for the tumblers. The first one clicked into place. The second, lightning flashed, illuminating her hands in a stark, frozen tableau. A distant rumble of thunder. The third tumbler. The fourth. The patrol would be heading back soon. Her window was closing. The final pin clicked over. The lock turned. She pushed the heavy door open and slipped inside, Ghost right behind her. She didn't use her flashlight. She put on a pair of night vision goggles, another relic from her crate. The world resolved into a pale, ghostly green. The office was Spartan, a few desks, computer terminals, all dark, and rows upon rows of gray filing cabinets. The jackpot. A label on the nearest cabinet read, Injection well logs, 1995 to 1998. She started pulling open drawers. They were filled with binders, thousands of pages of manifests, chemical analyses, daily logs, all meticulously signed by Mark Sterling. It was the complete, unvarnished history of their crime. She couldn't take it all. She pulled out her phone and began to photograph the most damning pages, her hands moving with frantic speed. Manifests for PCBs, dioxin, hexavalent chromium. Signed authorizations from corporate headquarters. Memos discussing the cost-effectiveness of their disposal method versus legal, safe alternatives. A low growl from Ghost. Anya froze. He was at the door, his body rigid, a low rumble in his chest. Headlights. The patrol was back early. She heard the SUV skid to a stop outside. The diversion hadn't held them long enough. Doors slammed. Angry voices cut through the storm. What the hell happened to the power? Generator didn't kick in. Call Sterling. Anya's blood ran cold. She was trapped. She had the proof, but she was deep inside the enemy's lair, and they were at the gate. The voices outside were sharp with alarm, amplified by the unnatural quiet of the powerless compound. Anya's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady roar of the storm. She had seconds. Her training took over, pushing panic aside with cold, hard logic. Never get cornered. Always have an exit strategy. But there was no other exit. The building was a concrete box. Ghost let out another low, guttural growl, not of aggression, but of warning. The guards were at the door. Anya scanned the room in the ghostly green light of her goggles. The filing cabinets. They were heavy, steel, bolted to the floor. Cover. She moved silently to the far end of the room, pulling Ghost with her, and crouched behind the last row of cabinets. She drew her pistol, the familiar way to small comfort. The sound of a key scraping in the manual lock was deafening. The heavy steel door groaned open. Two figures, silhouetted against the strobing lightning, stepped inside. They were large men, more like thugs than security guards. One held a heavy mag light, its powerful beam cutting a swath through the darkness. Check the breaker panel. The first one grunted. Someone might have flipped it. The beam of light swept the room, playing over the desks and computer monitors. Anya held her breath, pressing herself and the dog tight against the cold steel of the cabinet. The beam passed inches from their position. Looks clear, the second man said. Breakers in the back. He started walking toward her end of the room. Ghost tensed under her hand, his muscles coiling like springs. Anya tightened her grip on his ruff, praying he would remain silent. A single bark would be fatal. The guard was getting closer. 10 feet. 5. The beam of his flashlight danced on the wall just above her head. In that moment, Anya knew she would have to fight her way out. The thought was grim, but clear. She would not be taken. Just as the guard reached the end of the row of cabinets, a deafening crack of thunder shook the entire building, so loud and close it felt like an artillery strike. Simultaneously, lightning hit a transformer somewhere nearby with a sizzling explosion of blue light. Outside, The backup generator, perhaps jolted by the power surge, sputtered to life with a roar. The emergency lights inside the office flickered on, casting a harsh, sterile glare. The guard, startled by the sudden noise and light, jumped back. What the hell was that? In that split second of confusion and distraction, Anya saw her chance. It wasn't an escape route, but an opportunity. While the first guard was momentarily blinded by the lights, and the second was staring at the now-humming breaker panel, she needed to create a new exit. She looked at the far wall. Ben's map hadn't shown it, but there was a small, grated ventilation duct near the floor, about 2 feet square. It was a long shot. "Go," she whispered to Ghost, pointing at the 2 men. It was not an attack command. It was a diversion. Ghost erupted from behind the cabinet, not as an attacker, but as a chaotic force. He didn't bark, he didn't bite. He launched himself into the center of the room, a gray blur of motion, knocking over a chair, sending a stack of papers flying. The 2 guards spun around, momentarily stunned by the sudden appearance of a large, silent wolf-like creature in the secured building. "What the?" one started to yell. That was all the time Anya needed. She slammed her boot into the ventilation grate. The cheap metal buckled. A second kick, and it flew off, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel. She holstered her pistol and scrambled in, her shoulders barely clearing the opening. It was a tight squeeze, the rough metal scraping her back. "Ghost here," she commanded. The dog, his job done, disengaged from the confused guards and bolted for the opening, wriggling through just as the first guard recovered his senses and started toward them. "Hey, stop!" Anya crawled frantically through the dark, dusty duct. It was suffocating, filled with the smell of rust and dead rodents. Behind her, she could hear the guards shouting, one of them trying to get a shot into the narrow opening. A gunshot boomed in the confined space, the bullet ricocheting off the metal walls with a terrifying shriek. She pushed forward, shoving with her feet, pulling with her hands. The duct sloped downward, and she began to slide, picking up speed. It ended abruptly, dumping her unceremoniously onto a pile of damp leaves and mud on the far side of the building, just outside the fence line. Ghost landed beside her a second later. Alarms began to blare across the compound, a piercing, ugly sound. The game was over. Stealth had failed. Now it was just a race. Anya got to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her scraped back and knees. "Home, Ghost. Go," she commanded, and they plunged into the storm-tossed woods, the sounds of the alarm and the guards shouting fading behind them. They ran for 2 miles through the driving rain and treacherous terrain, their lungs burning, driven by pure adrenaline. They didn't stop until they reached Jed's truck. Anya fumbled for the keys, her hands shaking, and threw the vehicle into gear, fishtailing on the muddy track before finding purchase. As she drove, the full weight of what had just happened crashed down on her. She had the evidence. Dozens of photos on her phone, a smoking gun that pointed directly to Sterling and the highest levels of TerraVex. But she had been seen. They knew. They knew someone had been inside the archive, and they knew it was a woman with a gray dog. Her quiet life in Havenwood was over. She was no longer a recluse. She was a witness, a target. The fight had just become infinitely more personal and far more dangerous. The drive back to Havenwood was a blur of rain-streaked darkness and the thrumming of the old truck's engine. Anya didn't go to her home at the general store. It was compromised. They would be coming for her. Instead, she drove to the far side of her property, to a cluster of old, collapsed mine shafts she had discovered during her initial survey. She parked the truck in a deep arroyo, covering it with a camouflage tarp, and took her pack. With Ghost at her side, she found the most stable-looking of the mine entrances, a dark maw in the side of a hill, shored up with ancient, rotting timbers. It was a desperate move, a reversion to the most basic survival instinct: go to ground. Inside, the air was cold and damp, smelling of wet stone and decay. She used her flashlight sparingly, finding a small, dry alcove a few dozen feet from the entrance. This would be their command post. She sat on the cold rock, her body screaming with exhaustion and pain, and finally allowed herself to assess the situation. She had the proof on her phone, but the phone's battery was dying, and she had no way to transmit the data from here. The sat phone was for calls and texts only. She was cut off, isolated, and hunted. Sterling would not call the police. This was not a matter for the law. It was a matter of corporate damage control, and men like him used a different set of tools for that. He would send his own people, men who operated outside the rules, to clean up his mess. And she was the mess. A wave of despair washed over her, cold and numbing. What had she been thinking? A 62-year-old woman, a farmer, and a mechanic against a multi-billion-dollar corporation? It was suicide. She had failed. She had exposed herself and her allies for nothing. Ghost, sensing her despair, pushed his heavy head onto her lap and whined softly. She looked into his eyes, and she didn't see fear. She saw trust. Unwavering, absolute trust. He wasn't afraid. He was with her, and that was all that mattered. The dog's simple, profound loyalty was a lifeline. It pulled her back from the edge. She had not failed yet. She was a soldier. Soldiers adapted. Soldiers overcame. She took a deep breath, the cold air clearing her head. Okay, reevaluate. What were her assets? She had the evidence. She had allies, however outgunned they might be. She had intimate knowledge of the terrain. And she had Ghost. What were the enemy's assets? Manpower, money, and technology. They would use thermal imaging, maybe even drones, to search for her. They would assume she'd run, try to get to the authorities. They wouldn't expect her to double back, to hide right under their noses. She took out her phone. 15% battery. She scrolled through the pictures of the documents, her mind racing. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming. It needed to be seen. It needed to be released. She composed a text message to Jed. Compromised. Have evidence. Gone to ground. Need pickup. Sunrise. Old Quarry Road crossing. Bring Martha's nephew. Martha had mentioned her nephew, a young, idealistic reporter for a small, independent online news outlet in the state capital. He was her last, best hope. A direct handoff to someone who could get the story out before TerraVex's lawyers could bury it. She typed, "Tell him to be ready to run. This is his story." She hit send, the message disappearing into the ether. Then she powered the phone off to conserve the last of its battery. All she could do now was wait for dawn and hope her message got through. The hours crawled by. The storm passed, leaving behind a profound silence broken only by the dripping of water deep within the mine. Anya dozed fitfully, her pistol in her lap, her hand resting on Ghost's back. She dreamt of Afghanistan, of the faces of her fallen soldiers, their eyes asking her a silent question. Was it worth it? When she awoke, the first pale light of dawn was filtering into the mine entrance. It was time. She and Ghost moved out, sticking to the shadows, using the terrain for cover. The Quarry Road crossing was 5 miles away, a disused track on the far edge of her property. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. They were exposed now, moving through enemy territory. They reached the crossing point, a small clearing where the old road forded a shallow creek, and took up an overwatch position on a rocky outcrop. The sun was just beginning to crest the mesas, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a beautiful, peaceful morning, a stark contrast to the violence of the night. A few minutes after sunrise, she heard it, the sound of an approaching vehicle. But it wasn't Jed's familiar truck. It was a black SUV, identical to Sterling's. It came to a stop in the clearing below. Sterling himself got out of the passenger side. The driver, a large, grim-faced man, remained behind the wheel. Anya's heart sank. It was an ambush. They had intercepted her message. Or Jed had been caught. Sterling stood by his vehicle, looking around the clearing as if he were admiring the scenery. "Anya Sharma," he called out, his voice echoing in the quiet morning air. "I know you're out here. Let's be reasonable. You've made your point. You're a formidable woman. I admire that." He took a few steps toward the creek. "But this is over. You have something that belongs to me. I have something you might want. A way out of this. A clean slate. No charges. In fact, a generous settlement for your troubles and your property. Enough to let you and your dog disappear and live out the rest of your days in actual peace." It was the classic carrot and stick. A bribe, backed by an unspoken, but obvious, threat. "There's no version of this where you win, Anya," he shouted, his voice losing its smooth edge. "We have lawyers who can keep this tied up in court until your grandchildren are dead. We have influence. We can paint you as a disgruntled, delusional old woman, a domestic terrorist who broke into our facility. Who are they going to believe?" Anya remained silent, motionless in her hiding spot. He was right, of course. In a conventional fight, she would lose. But she wasn't fighting a conventional fight anymore. From the opposite direction, she heard another engine. Jed's truck. It came bouncing down the road and screeched to a halt on the other side of the clearing. Jed got out, his face grim. With him was a young man with a press pass hanging around his neck and a camera in his hand, Martha's nephew. They had walked into the trap. Sterling smiled, a triumphant, predatory grin. It seems your friends have arrived. Now you can all listen to my very reasonable offer. He gestured to his driver, who got out of the SUV. The man was holding a high-powered rifle. The situation had reached its final, deadly climax. The clearing was a frozen tableau of impending violence. Sterling, radiating smug confidence. His man, the rifle held at a low ready. Jed and the young reporter, trapped and terrified. And Anya, watching from the rocks above, her mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations. There were no good options, only less terrible ones. Ghost, sensing the shift in her body, the coiling of her muscles, pressed against her leg, a low growl vibrating in his chest. "Stay," she whispered, the command absolute. She could try a shot from here, but it was a long one, over 100 yards. A pistol at that range was a prayer, not a weapon. And the moment she fired, Jed and the reporter would be caught in the crossfire. Sterling held up his hands in a parody of peace. "No need for any unpleasantness," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Anya, just come on down. Give me the phone. We sign a little non-disclosure agreement. I transfer a great deal of money to your account, and we all go home. It's just business." It was the casual depravity of the statement that broke through Anya's tactical focus and hit her on a purely human level. Just business. The poisoned water, the dead cattle, the sick children, the men who died of cancer. All just entries on a corporate ledger. In that moment, her objective changed. It was no longer about escape. It was about justice. The kind of justice that doesn't come from a courtroom. A plan, desperate and lethal, formed in her mind. It was a high-risk, low-probability maneuver, the kind she had trained for but never wanted to execute. She looked at Ghost. He looked back, his intelligent eyes understanding what she could not say. He was not just her companion. He was her force multiplier. "Jed," Anya's voice, hard as iron, cracked through the morning air, startling everyone. "Get in the truck." "Now," Sterling laughed. "A little late for a heroic exit, don't you think?" He nodded to his man, who raised the rifle, centering it on Jed's chest. Anya knew she had only a second. She took a deep breath. "Ghost, watch." It was a German command from his earliest training days. Not attack, not heal, watch. It designated a specific target for his absolute, focused attention. She had pointed with her eyes, just for a fraction of a second, at the gunman. Then she did the last thing anyone expected. She stood up. Exposed on the ridgeline, she was the perfect target. "It's me you want, Sterling," she yelled, drawing every eye in the clearing to her. "Let them go." The gunman, confused by the new, primary threat, swung the rifle barrel toward her. It was the moment she'd been waiting for. "Ghost, fast." The command was not a shout, but a sharp, explosive bark. "Take him." Ghost launched himself from the rocks like a gray missile. He didn't run down the path. He took a direct, vertical route, bounding from boulder to boulder with preternatural agility. The gunman, his attention on Anya, didn't see him coming until it was too late. Ghost hit him not with his teeth, but with the full, 90-pound force of his body, a battering ram of bone and muscle aimed at the man's legs. The rifle discharged, the shot going wild, echoing through the canyon. The man crumpled with a scream of pain, his knee bending at an unnatural angle. In the same instant, Anya fired her own pistol. Not at Sterling, but at the engine block of the black SUV. The 9mm round punched through the grille, and a plume of steam erupted from the radiator. The vehicle was disabled. Sterling stood frozen for a second, his face a mask of disbelief as his perfect plan disintegrated into chaos. The young reporter, snapping out of his shock, raised his camera and started filming, the motor drive whirring loudly in the sudden silence. Jed, bless his stubborn heart, didn't get in the truck. He grabbed a tire iron from the truck bed and started advancing on Sterling, his face a mask of cold fury. "This is for Hemlock, you son of a bitch," he snarled. Sterling, seeing the tide turn so completely against him, fumbled inside his jacket. Anya knew he'd be armed. She fired again, aiming for the ground at his feet. The bullet kicked up a cloud of dust, and Sterling yelped, stumbling backward. "It's over, Sterling," Anya yelled, her voice carrying the absolute authority of command. "Your man is down. Your vehicle is disabled. And your crimes are being broadcast live. For all I know," the reporter, emboldened, moved closer, his camera a third eye capturing Sterling's unraveling. Sterling looked from the advancing old man with the tire iron, to the gray dog standing over his moaning henchman, to the camera lens, and finally up at the woman on the ridge, a figure of righteous judgment against the morning sun. He crumbled. The arrogance, the menace, it all drained away, leaving a pale, terrified man in an expensive suit. He raised his hands in surrender. Sirens wailed in the distance. Martha, the ever-practical soldier, must have called the state police the moment Jed and her nephew left, providing the cavalry. The fight for Havenwood was over. Anya lowered her pistol, her arm trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. She looked down at the scene below, a story of small-town courage, of ordinary people pushed too far. Ghost looked up at her, wagging his tail once, a silent mission accomplished. Anya slid down from the rocks and walked into the clearing, no longer a hermit, no longer a ghost. She was Anya Sharma, and she was home. The aftermath was a whirlwind of noise and officialdom, a stark contrast to the silence Anya had so carefully cultivated. State police, EPA investigators in hazmat suits, and news crews from across the country descended on Havenwood and Barrows Creek. The story exploded. The photos from Anya's phone, combined with the TerraVex documents and Ben Carter's testimony, were an irrefutable indictment. The young reporter, Martha's nephew, became a star overnight, his raw footage of the standoff at the quarry playing on a continuous loop on national news. Sterling, his corporate empire crumbling, sang like a canary, implicating executives all the way to the top of the parent company in Houston. The ensuing scandal was colossal, leading to congressional hearings, massive fines, and a federal mandate for the complete excavation and cleanup of the TerraVex site, a process that would take decades and cost billions. Anya, however, retreated from the spotlight. She gave one quiet, comprehensive deposition to the federal investigators and then refused all interview requests. She had not sought fame or recognition. She had sought justice, and it had been served. Her war was over. 6 months later, a fragile peace began to return to the valley. The TerraVex land was seized by the government, a massive, fenced-off zone of remediation. Heavy machinery rumbled in the hills, not to poison the earth, but to begin the slow, arduous process of healing it. In Havenwood, things were different, too. The town was no longer entirely abandoned. A small, temporary office for the EPA cleanup supervisor was set up in the old post office. Jed drove out twice a week with supplies. Martha's goats were receiving specialized veterinary care, paid for by a victims' compensation fund, and were showing signs of recovery. Ben Carter had been hired as a consultant for the cleanup crew, his intimate knowledge of the injection wells now being used to undo the damage he'd been forced to inflict. He walked with a new purpose, the slump of defeat gone from his shoulders. Anya and Ghost still sat on the porch of the general store in the afternoons, but they were no longer entirely alone. Sometimes Jed would join them for a coffee. Sometimes Martha would bring a jar of goat cheese. They didn't talk much, but the silence was no longer one of isolation. It was a comfortable, shared quiet. The land was still scarred, a patchwork of healthy scrub and the dead, excavated zones where the contaminated soil had been removed. It was a reminder of the battle they had fought and won. One crisp autumn evening, Anya stood on a rise overlooking the town, Ghost at her side. The setting sun bathed the landscape in a soft, golden light. She was looking at a letter she'd received that day. It was from the daughter of Corporal Martinez, the young soldier who had died in her arms so many years ago. The young woman, now a college student studying environmental science, had seen the story on the news. "My mother always told me in her letters that you were the best officer she ever knew," the letter read. "She said you always fought to protect your people. When I saw what you did for that town, for that land, I finally understood what she meant. Thank you for continuing her fight." Anya folded the letter, a tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. The guilt she had carried for so long, the heavy burden of survival, began to lift, replaced by a sense of peace that was deeper and more profound than the simple absence of noise she had first sought here. It was the peace of a mission completed, of a promise kept. She had not been able to save Martinez or Evans, but she had saved this place. She had honored their memory not by hiding from the world, but by defending a small piece of it with the same ferocity and integrity with which they had served. She had found her redemption in the poisoned soil of a forgotten town. Ghost nudged her hand, his amber eyes full of a wisdom that transcended words. He had led her here, to this broken place, and had shown her the way through. He had been her anchor, her partner, her silent, gray conscience. "It's good land, boy," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Good land. The first stars began to appear in the vast, darkening sky. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, and for the first time, it didn't sound lonely. It sounded like a promise. The work was not over. The healing would take a long time. But here, in the heart of Havenwood, a new future was being written, one of resilience, of community, and of a quiet, enduring hope, guarded by an old soldier and her faithful dog.